Harper Lane pressed that single-dollar bill into Ethan Kincaid's palm with a hand that hadn't stopped shaking since her father's funeral, and she didn't care who saw it tremble. Inside that corral, ashbreakers screamed against the steel fence like something the world had already broken and forgotten to bury. Every man on that ranch took one step back. Harper took one step forward. If you've ever had to prove your worth to someone who'd already made up their mind about you, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel. Follow this story all the way to the end and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 arrived in Mill Haven, Wyoming, like a debt collector without warning, without mercy, and without any intention of leaving until it had taken everything it came for. By the time July settled its full weight onto the valley, the creek beds had cracked into dry mouths, the grass had gone the color of old bone, and every living thing on the Kincaid spread moved slower, breathed shallower, and spoke less than it had in April. The heat didn't just sit on a man. It pressed down, like a hand on the back of a neck. Harper Lane felt it the moment she stepped off the supply wagon and set both feet into the dust of the main yard. She had been riding that wagon for 40 minutes. Before that, she'd worked a 6-hour breakfast shift at Martha Pritchard's diner on the south end of town, pouring coffee and carrying plates until the skin between her fingers had gone raw. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours. She hadn't eaten since yesterday evening. And her boots, the ones with the cracked left sole she'd been meaning to repair for 3 months, had worn a blister onto her heel that made every step feel like a small punishment. None of that was what people saw when they looked at her standing in Ethan Kincaid's yard. What they saw was a girl. 26 years old, maybe. Slight-framed, road-dusty, dressed plain. Hair pulled back with a piece of cord because she'd lost her last good ribbon in February and hadn't gotten around to replacing it. No hat, no horse of her own, no man standing beside her. What they saw, in other words, was nothing worth looking at. "You lost," called one of the hands from near the water trough. He was leaning on a fence post watching her with the particular kind of lazy amusement that men reserve for things they've already decided aren't a threat. Harper looked at him evenly. "I'm looking for Mr. Kincaid." "Mr. Kincaid don't see walk-ins." "Then he can tell me that himself." The hand straightened slightly. Something in her tone had interrupted his amusement. Not hostility, she hadn't raised her voice. Just a flatness. Like a woman who had already calculated exactly how much energy this conversation was worth and had allocated accordingly. "You got business here?" he asked. "I have a proposition," she said. "For the horse." That changed the temperature of the yard. 3 other hands had been moving through their chores in the background, hauling water, mending tack, doing the ordinary slow work of a summer morning on a working ranch. They stopped, not all at once, one by one, like candles going out. The hand at the fence post lost his smile. "Which horse?" he said. It wasn't a question. He knew. "The black," Harper said. "The one in the east corral." And from somewhere behind the far fence, as if it had heard her, Ashbreaker hit the steel rail so hard the impact rang out across the whole yard like a gunshot. Ethan Kincaid was not a man people kept waiting. He was 41 years old and had built the Kincaid spread from 400 acres of nothing into the largest operating cattle ranch in the county. And he had done it by being the kind of person who made decisions quickly, acted on them without apology, and never once in his adult life had looked back to wonder whether he'd been wrong. He was not cruel in the obvious way. He didn't shout, didn't throw things, didn't make threats. He didn't intend to keep. He simply operated on the baseline assumption that his judgment was correct. His authority was settled, and anyone standing in his yard without an invitation had better have a very good reason for being there. He came out of the main house still buttoning his cuff, which meant someone had interrupted him at his desk, which meant he was already measuring this woman against the cost of the interruption before she'd opened her mouth. He stopped 10 feet from her and looked her over. The way he'd look over a piece of equipment someone was trying to sell him, not unkindly, but with the dispassionate efficiency of a man who priced things for a living. "You're from Martha's place," he said. "I work there," Harper said. "Yes, sir." "You're the one whose father had that little parcel out on the Flat Creek Road. Died last winter." February. He nodded once like he was confirming a figure in a ledger. "What do you want?" Harper reached into the front pocket of her apron and drew out a folded dollar bill. She held it out toward him between two fingers. Ethan Kincaid looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at it again. $1, Harper said, "for the black stallion in the East Corral." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. You could feel the ranch hands holding their breath. You could feel the heat pressing down on all of them. You could feel the weight of what she'd just said settling into the air like dust after a collapse. And then Ethan Kincaid laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It wasn't a performance. It was the quiet, almost private laugh of a man who finds something genuinely, unexpectedly funny and also slightly pitiful. $1, he repeated. "Yes, sir." "That horse," Ethan said, his voice shifting back into something flatter, "has put 2 men in the doctor's office. One of them still can't use his left hand properly. Rourke, my foreman, says the animal is past working with. I've been trying to decide whether to cut my losses and put him down or sell him to the Pendleton people and let them make their problem somebody else's." "He's not past working with," Harper said. "I've had 2 professional horse breakers out here," Ethan said. "Men who've done this their whole careers. Both of them walked away. One of them told me, and I am quoting him exactly, that the horse was broken wrong from the start, and nothing short of a miracle was going to fix it." "Then I'll need the afternoon," Harper said. Ethan studied her for a long moment. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. Not contempt, he was past that. Something more like genuine curiosity about what kind of person stands in a strange man's yard offering $1 for a killer horse and speaks about it the way other people speak about a Tuesday errand. "You step into that corral," he said slowly, "and I won't be held responsible for what happens to you." "I'm not asking you to be. You've got nobody. No father, no husband, no kin nearby that I know of. You'd be leaving Martha short-handed at the diner." "Mr. Kincaid," Harper said, and something in her voice shifted, not harder exactly, but more precise, like a tool being picked up and properly gripped. "I'm not here to break that horse. I'm here to prove that you already did." Ethan Kincaid went very still. Behind her, one of the hands exhaled slowly. The dollar bill trembled once in the dry wind between them. "Matrone." Rourke Malloy had been Ethan Kincaid's foreman for 7 years, and in those 7 years, he had developed a particular professional pride in his ability to read trouble before it arrived and handle it before it spread. He was a big man, not tall but wide through the chest and shoulders, with hands that looked like they'd been designed by someone who thought regular hands were insufficiently serious. He had a scar along his left jawline from a horse that had gotten the better of him once, early in his career, and he had made sure it never happened again by being the kind of foreman who did not negotiate with animals and did not allow sentiment to interfere with efficiency. When Luke Mercer came to find him at the equipment shed and told him there was a woman in the yard talking about buying Ashbreaker for $1, Rourke's first reaction was to keep working on the harness he was repairing. His second reaction, 30 seconds later, was to put the harness down and walk toward the yard. He arrived in time to hear the tail end of what she'd said to Ethan, something about proving that the horse was already broken, and he stood at the edge of the group with his arms crossed and his expression doing something between a smirk and a scowl. "Who told you about the horse?" he asked her directly, cutting across whatever Ethan had been about to say. Harper turned to look at him. "Word gets around." "Word gets around," Rourke repeated. He said it the way you'd repeat a sentence from a language you found mildly offensive. "You a horse handler? I've worked with horses." "That horse," Rourke said, "isn't horses. That horse is a problem we've been managing for 6 months. We've tried everything short of putting him down, and I'll be honest with you, miss, the only reason we haven't is because Mr. Kincaid doesn't like waste. But there's a point where the cost of managing a dangerous animal outweighs whatever value you thought it had." "What have you tried?" Harper asked. Rourke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Every standard method. Give me a specific one. The foreman looked at her with the particular blankness of a man who is deciding whether to be offended. We've used rope correction, isolation, pressure training, the works. Did any of it work? Not sustainably. Right? Harper said simply. She turned back to Ethan. That's what I mean. Luke Mercer was standing near the edge of the crowd of hands slightly behind the others, and he had been watching Harper Lane with an expression that nobody else in the yard was wearing, a mix of anxious and something that might have been hope, if hope were the kind of thing a 22-year-old stable hand allowed himself in front of his employer. Luke had been the one who'd started whispering to the other hands about what Rourke did to Ashbreaker in the first months. He hadn't meant to be a witness to any of it. He'd just been doing his job cleaning the stall 3 doors down, moving through routine, and the sounds had traveled. The sounds always traveled. He hadn't said anything to anyone who could do something about it. He'd told himself there was nothing to be done. That this was ranching. That animals didn't have the kinds of rights that people spent social capital defending. He was still telling himself that. But he watched Harper Lane standing in the dust of the yard holding that dollar bill, and he felt something uncomfortable moving through him. "All right," Ethan Kincaid said finally. The word landed quietly, but it changed the shape of the moment. Rourke's head turned toward his employer. "Ethan." "I said all right." Ethan's voice didn't change in volume or temperature, but something in it discouraged continuation. He looked at Harper. "You've got until sundown. The horse is yours for $1 if you can put a rider on him today. If you can't, you walk off this property, and we don't have this conversation again." "That's fair," Harper said. "It isn't remotely fair to you," Ethan said. "But it's the deal I'm offering." She held out the dollar. He took it, held it for a moment, then tucked it into his vest pocket with a small, humorless exhale. "Luke," he called without looking away from Harper. The young stable hand stepped forward from the back of the group. "Sir, show her the East Corral. Give her access to the tack room. Don't let Rourke's people near the corral while she's working." He said that last part, still looking at Harper like it was meant for her to hear not as a concession, but as information about what she was walking into. Rourke said nothing, but his arms tightened across his chest, and something in his expression went from scowling to very, very still, which in Harper's experience of certain kinds of men was actually the more dangerous of the two. She followed Luke toward the east end of the property. Behind her, she heard Ethan Kincaid say to nobody in particular, "I want to see this," and Luke Mercer walked beside her without speaking for 20 paces. Then he said quietly, "You know what that horse did to the last 2 men who went in there?" "I heard," Harper said. "One of them was experienced, 20 years with horses. He lasted about 40 seconds before Ashbreaker had him against the fence." "Was the man using a whip?" Luke hesitated. "A lead rope." Nodded. "That's a whip," Harper said. Another silence. "What are you going to use?" "Nothing," she said. Luke glanced at her sideways. He was trying to determine if she was serious or reckless or both, or something else that didn't have a clean category. "Nothing," he repeated. "Nothing that looks like a weapon to him," she said. "Which is most things at this point. But we'll see what he tolerates." They had reached the East Corral. Harper stopped at the outer fence and looked through the rails. Ashbreaker was at the far end, moving in tight, agitated circles. He was black, a deep, almost blue-black that the summer sun made look almost warm, though nothing else about him did. He was big, 17 hands at least built through the chest and hindquarters, with the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself. There were marks on his lower legs where rope had been applied too tightly too many times, and one ear had a notch in it that hadn't been there when Ethan Kincaid had purchased him 2 years ago. Harper noted these things the way a doctor notes symptoms, quietly, without editorializing. "He knows we're here," Luke said. "He knew we were here before we got to the fence," Harper said. "He's been watching us for the last 30 yards. The horse's circling hadn't changed, but his ear had been fixed in their direction the entire time. "He's not running," Harper said. "He rarely runs," Luke said. "He attacks. That's what makes him." "He's not running," Harper said again. And this time it wasn't an observation. It was the beginning of an argument she was having with the narrative that everyone on this ranch had agreed to about this animal. Something running from danger and something staying to fight aren't the same. One is an animal that wants to escape. The other is an animal that's learned escape is impossible and has decided that the best it can do is hurt you before you hurt it. Luke was quiet for a moment. "Those aren't actually different outcomes for the person on the receiving end." "No," Harper said. "But they're completely different problems. And you solve them completely different ways." She stepped back from the fence and went to the tack room. She spent 40 minutes in the tack room. Not preparing equipment or not much of it, she came out with a simple rope halter. No bit, no spurs. A saddle pad she'd looked at for a long time before selecting. She moved things around on the shelves. She put things back. Luke stood in the doorway and watched her the way you watch someone defuse something. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead." "How do you know it'll work, whatever you're doing?" Harper set the halter down on the rail outside the corral and turned to face him. She looked at him directly, which he hadn't fully been prepared for. She had the kind of attention that when she applied it, you felt as a physical thing. "I don't," she said. "Then why?" "Because I know what doesn't work. And everything your foreman has tried doesn't work. Not because those methods don't work on horses. They work on some horses. They don't work on this horse, because this horse has already been taught that pressure means pain. And pain is the only certain thing in the world, and the safest response to anything uncertain is to end it violently before it ends you." She paused. When an animal or a person has learned that you don't overcome it with more pressure, you become the first thing in their experience that isn't. Luke was quiet for a long moment. "Your father teach you that?" he asked. "My father," Harper said, "taught me everything I know about horses. Yeah." She picked up the halter and turned toward the corral gate. "Miss Lane," Luke said. She stopped. "Rourke isn't going to like this, whatever happens today. Even if it goes well, especially if it goes well, he's not going to like it." He hesitated. "He's a man who needs to be the one who solved the problem. You understand what I'm saying?" Harper looked back at him over her shoulder. "I understand exactly what you're saying." She opened the corral gate and stepped inside. The afternoon collapsed into its own specific silence. The hands who had drifted back to their work drifted back again slowly, without discussing it the way people are drawn toward things they don't have language for. Ethan Kincaid stood at the outer fence with his arms resting on the top rail. Rourke Malloy stood 20 yards back from the corral, apart from the others, his arms crossed, his face arranged into careful neutrality. Luke Mercer stood at the gate, one hand on the latch, though he didn't know what he'd do with it if he needed to move fast. Inside the corral, Harper Lane walked to the center of the space and then stopped. She did not approach the horse. She stood still. Ashbreaker had stopped his circling the moment the gate opened. Now he stood at the far end of the corral, head up, nostrils working the air. Every muscle in his body coiled to a state that was not yet violence, but was the thing immediately preceding it. Harper stood in the dust and said nothing, did nothing. The sun moved, the heat pressed. The corral fence creaked once in a dry gust. And then something happened that made Luke Mercer exhale so slowly that no one around him heard it. Harper sat down, right there in the middle of the corral. She folded herself down into the dust and sat with her knees pulled up and her back straight and her hands resting loose on her legs, and she looked at a point somewhere between her and the horse, not at him, not away from him, just at the middle distance, and she was still. "What is she doing?" someone behind Luke murmured. "I have no idea," someone else answered. Rourke Malloy said nothing. Ethan Kincaid said nothing. Ashbreaker took one step forward. Just one. Then stopped. His head dropped an inch, not in relaxation, but in attention. Recalibrating. The thing in the corral with him had changed its shape, and he was trying to understand what kind of threat this new shape was. Harper didn't move. The horse took another step, and then from her very quietly, so quietly that the people at the fence couldn't be sure they'd heard it at all, came a sound, low and rhythmic, not words. A kind of humming, steady and unhurried with a pattern to it that had the shape of something very old. Ethan Kincaid straightened slightly at the fence, because even from 20 feet away he recognized what that sound was. Not the tune exactly, but the intention behind it. The sound of someone saying without language, "I am not what you're afraid of. I am not another version of the thing that hurt you. I am something else entirely, and I can stay here for as long as it takes for you to figure that out." Ashbreaker stood motionless in the afternoon light, and slowly, so slowly it was almost imagined, his ear turned. Not back in alarm, forward, toward the sound. The sun was still burning over Kincaid's spread like a judgment day. But something in the east corral had just shifted quiet as a change in wind direction, and every person standing at that fence could feel it without being able to name it. The sense that the story they had all agreed on about this horse and what was possible for him had just developed without permission a crack. Ashbreaker took 3 more steps before he stopped again. That was the thing nobody at the fence had expected, not the steps themselves, but the quality of them. They weren't aggressive. They weren't the hard, deliberate strikes of an animal moving toward a target. They were something more careful than that. Tentative almost. The steps of a creature that had spent so long inside a single story about the world that it didn't quite know what to do when the world stopped behaving according to that story. Harper kept humming. She hadn't moved, hadn't adjusted her position by so much as an inch. The dust around her had settled back into stillness, and she sat in the middle of it, like something that had always been there, like a stone in a riverbed that the water moves around without disturbing. Luke Mercer had his hand pressed flat against the corral gate so hard the wood grain was pressing into his palm, and he hadn't noticed. Ethan Kincaid was watching with the particular intensity of a man whose certainty about something has just been interrupted, and who hasn't yet decided whether to be interested or annoyed by the interruption. And Rourke Malloy 20 yards back had not moved, had not uncrossed his arms, had not changed his expression in any way that anyone looking at him could have identified, but something behind his eyes had tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the horse. Ashbreaker dropped his head another 2 inches, and then he did the thing that made 3 grown men at that fence hold their breath at the same moment without coordinating it. He exhaled. Not a snort. Not the sharp warning expulsion of air that horses use as punctuation before aggression. A slow, long, unsteady release, the kind of breath that a body takes when something that has been held too tightly for too long has been just briefly allowed to loosen. "Lord Almighty," somebody behind Luke whispered. Luke didn't look away from the corral. Harper heard the exhale. She'd been listening for it. She'd been tracking his breath the same way her father had taught her to track it, not as sound, but as information, the most honest thing an animal can give you, because it's the one thing they can't choose to withhold. She let 2 full beats of her humming pass before she did anything at all. Then she turned her head very slowly and looked directly at the horse for the first time since she'd sat down. Ashbreaker's ears swiveled. His front left hoof shifted. Harper held his gaze and kept humming, and did not look away. The next 4 minutes were the quietest 4 minutes the Kincaid spread had experienced all summer. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved much. The heat was still crushing, and the sun was still indifferent, and the dust was still dry and fine, and everything about the physical facts of the afternoon was exactly the same as it had been an hour ago. But something inside that corral was reorganizing itself around a new arrangement, and everyone watching could feel the reorganization happening, even though none of them could have described the mechanism. Ashbreaker walked toward her. Not charging, not posturing, walking. He covered the distance between them in 12 slow strides, and stopped 4 feet from where she sat, and he put his nose down and he smelled the top of her hair. She let him. She sat perfectly still, and let him take in whatever information he was gathering, and she kept the sound going low, rhythmic, unhurried, and she didn't reach for him, and she didn't try to touch him, and she didn't do anything that could be interpreted as a move in the old game. He'd been forced to play for 6 months. After a long moment, she raised her right hand slowly from below, palm up, and held it in the air between them. The horse pulled his head back 2 inches. She waited. He brought his nose down to her hand. And Harper Lane, sitting in the dust of Ethan Kincaid's East Corral at 3 in the afternoon on the hottest day of the summer, let out a breath of her own that she had been holding, she realized, since February. Since her father's funeral. Since the moment she'd stood at the edge of that frozen creek bed and understood that the only person in the world who had ever looked at her and seen the full scope of what she was capable of was gone, and that the rest of the world was still operating on a very different assessment. She pressed her palm gently against the side of the stallion's face. He didn't pull away. Behind her from the fence, she heard Ethan Kincaid say something under his breath. Not to anyone in particular, just a quiet, involuntary sound. The kind that escapes a man when his internal model of what's possible has just been visibly revised. She didn't turn around. There was still work to do. The halter took another 20 minutes. She didn't rush it. She introduced the rope to him like you'd introduce a stranger to someone who'd been badly hurt by the last stranger, slowly with full transparency about what was happening, and why, giving him time to process each step before moving to the next. She let him smell the rope. She draped it across her own shoulders so he could get used to its presence as an extension of her rather than a tool separate from her. She held it against his neck for 60 full seconds before she began to position it. He sideswiped once a sharp instinctive pullback that sent a current of alarm through the group at the fence, but Harper moved with him instead of against him, and when he stopped, she was still there, still calm, still holding the rope at the same loose angle, still making that sound. He stood. She placed the halter. He let her. When she stood up from the dust and led him with a lead rope and no resistance. 3 complete circuits of the East Corral. The silence at the fence lasted for a full 5 seconds before someone said, "I'll be damned," loud enough to be heard across the yard. Luke Mercer laughed. It came out of him before he could stop it, and it was the laugh of someone who has just had something confirmed that they hadn't quite let themselves believe. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and turned it into a cough, but nobody was looking at him anyway. They were all watching Harper Lane walk a horse that had put 2 men in the doctor's office 3 circuits of an East Corral on a hot July afternoon, like it was nothing remarkable, like it was just a thing she'd decided to do today. Ethan Kincaid wasn't laughing. He was watching with his forearms still on the top rail and an expression that had moved past curiosity into something more complicated and less comfortable. The kind of expression that appears on a man's face when he has built a very organized picture of how things work, and someone has just without asking permission rearranged it. Rourke Malloy had walked away from the group entirely. Nobody mentioned it. Harper brought Ashbreaker to a stop near the center of the corral and stood beside him, with her hand resting easy on his neck. She turned and looked toward the fence, toward Ethan. "I'm going to need the saddle pad," she said. "The one I pulled out earlier." One of the hands scrambled for it. Ethan hadn't moved from the fence. "You're going to try to ride him today." "That was the deal," Harper said. "You don't have to prove that today. What you just did was half of what I said I'd do," Harper said. "The deal was a rider on him today. I'm the rider." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You're the most stubborn person I've met in a calendar year, and I say that as a man who looks in the mirror every morning." "I'll take that," Harper said, and something in her voice shifted just slightly, not warmth exactly, but the possibility of it, the way a door shifts in a frame before it opens. The hand brought the saddle pad. She placed it on Ashbreaker's back with the same careful methodology. Let him feel it on his withers. First, let him understand what it was. Moved it inch by inch until it was positioned right. He shifted his weight twice. Rolled one eye back toward her. She kept her hand on his neck and kept the low murmuring sound going, and waited until his breathing had settled again each time. When she finally put her foot in the stirrup, the yard went so quiet you could hear the creak, or you could have if the creek had still been running. She swung up and settled her weight into the saddle in one smooth, unhurried motion, and she sat there for a moment without asking him to move, just letting him adjust to the weight of her, letting him process the fact that there was a person on his back and the world had not, in this particular instance, immediately become worse because of it. Ashbreaker's ears went back, then forward. Then after a long 4 seconds he took a step, and Harper let him choose the direction. He walked the perimeter of the corral, not at her direction at his own, and she sat easy and balanced and went where he went, and she didn't pull the reins, and she didn't use her heels, and she didn't do anything to assert dominance over the line of travel, because that wasn't the point. The point in this moment was that he was moving with a rider, and the world had not collapsed, and that was enough. That was everything, actually. When they completed the circuit and came to a natural stop near the gate, Harper put her hand on his neck one more time. Then she looked up at the fence, at Ethan Kincaid, who was not saying anything. "I believe that's sundown approaching," she said. "The horse is mine." Ethan Kincaid reached into his vest pocket. He held up the dollar bill. "Yes," he said quietly. "He is." And something in the way he said it, not the words, but the register beneath the words, the tone that a man uses when he is watching something he doesn't entirely have language for, made Luke Mercer look away from the corral and look at his employer instead. And what he saw on Ethan Kincaid's face was not what he'd expected. Not irritation. Not the particular pride-wounded blankness of a man who's been shown up in front of his own crew. What he saw was something that looked, if he was reading it right, almost like relief. Like a man who has been holding a verdict for a long time that he wasn't certain was correct, and has just been given unexpectedly a reason to reconsider it. That was the moment Rourke Malloy came back. He walked in from the far side of the yard with his arms no longer crossed, his hands loose at his sides, his face arranged into an expression of perfect professional neutrality that Luke had learned over 7 years to read as its own kind of warning sign. Rourke's anger was never loudest when it was loud. It was loudest when it went quiet. "Impressive," Rourke said. He addressed Harper directly, which was unusual. Rourke typically directed his communications through the organizational structure rather than around it. "Really, I mean that sincerely. I don't know what method that is exactly, but it's, yeah, impressive." Harper looked at him. "Thank you. The question," Rourke said, "is whether it holds. Method like that, built on calm, built on the animal's cooperation, it's only as good as the next time someone has to actually work with him. Move cattle. Cover ground under pressure. You can't always have ideal conditions." "You're right," Harper said. "You can't. But you can build a foundation that holds under pressure instead of one that collapses under it. Those two approaches aren't equally reliable over time." "He was purchased for ranch work," Rourke said. "Professional horse-breaking methods exist for a reason. Those methods existed because people thought pain was the shortest distance between 2 points," Harper said, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Not heat, but precision, the kind that comes from having thought about something a very long time. "It isn't. It's the longest. Because every time you use it, you have to use it again. And you have to use more of it. Because what you've built is an animal or a person that complies when the pressure is on and falls apart the moment it isn't. That's not a trained horse. That's a trapped one." The yard had gone still again. Rourke looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he turned to Ethan. "She's not a ranch hand. She's not a trainer on contract, and that horse is a liability. If she takes him and something happens—" "I own him," Harper said. "As of about 4 minutes ago. Whatever happens with him is my business." "You're a waitress," Rourke said, flat and final like a door closing. "You work at Martha Pritchard's diner. You don't have a property to keep a horse on. You don't have the facilities to continue whatever this was, and—" "Rourke." Ethan's voice came out quietly, but it landed with the weight of something heavy set down on a table. One word. That was enough. Rourke stopped. Ethan looked at Harper. "Where are you planning to keep him?" This was the question she'd been waiting for. The one she'd spent 3 nights turning over in her head before she'd climbed onto that supply wagon this morning. "Martha has a paddock behind the diner property. She said I could use it." "Martha knows about this," Ethan said. It was not quite a question. "Martha suggested it," Harper said. She's the one who heard you were thinking about putting him down. Something moved through Ethan's expression at that, quickly, gone before Harper could fully read it. Martha Pritchard, he said almost to himself, then louder. All right, Luke. He looked at the young stable hand. Help Miss Lane get the horse loaded for transport. Give her whatever she needs from the tack room that she used today. Luke straightened. Yes, sir. Rourke said, Ethan, I want to go on record. Noted, Ethan said, and recorded. He turned away from the corral and walked back toward the main house with the unhurried step of a man who has made a decision and considers the matter closed. Rourke watched him go. Then he looked at Harper, and Harper looked back at him, and what passed between them in that look was not hostility exactly. She wasn't the kind of person who wasted energy on that, but clarity. The specific mutual clarity of two people who have just identified each other as representing two completely opposite answers to the same question, and who both understand that this conversation is nowhere near finished. Nice work today, miss, Rourke said. He walked away before she could answer. Luke appeared at her elbow. Don't mind him, he said, keeping his voice low. I'm not minding him, Harper said. I'm paying attention to him. Those are different things. They worked in companionable quiet for a while after that. Luke moving efficiently through the task of gathering tack and preparing transport, Harper working steadily beside Ashbreaker, keeping contact with him, keeping the transition as low pressure as everything that had come before it. She was aware of being watched from various points around the yard. She was aware of the conversations happening in low voices that paused when she moved within earshot. She was used to this. She'd been the object of a certain category of sideways attention in Millhaven for most of her life. The girl with the dead father and the broken-down property and the diner job and no prospects, the kind of person a small town files under a heading and stops reconsidering. She had a horse now. She wasn't sure what heading that put her under, but it was a different one. Can I ask you something? Luke said as they walked the horse toward the transport. You keep asking me that, Harper said, and then you ask the question anyway before I answer. He almost smiled. Fair enough. What's the story with your father and horses? You mentioned him earlier. The question landed differently than she'd expected. Not painfully, she was past the sharpest edge of that, but with a specific gravity that meant she took a moment before answering. He was the best natural horseman I ever saw, she said. Not trained, never had money for that, but he just understood them. The way they think, the way their fear works. He used to say that an animal's behavior is just its history, written in the only language it has. She paused. He had a horse when I was about 7 years old that everybody in the county said was vicious. Couldn't be worked, couldn't be near people. My dad spent 4 months with him, just sitting near him, working nearby, not demanding anything, not requiring anything, just being present without threat. She looked at Ashbreaker walking steady beside her. By the time he was done, that horse would follow him across a field without a lead rope. What happened to your dad? Luke asked. He said it gently, aware he was pressing. He got sick, Harper said. Last fall, quick, by February it was... She stopped, tried again. He was gone by February. I'm sorry, Luke said. Yeah, she said, and then quieter. He would have liked today. They reached the transport. Ashbreaker loaded without resistance, which made two of the watching hands exchange a look that communicated something that didn't have a clean verbal equivalent. A mix of bewilderment and the dawning recognition that what they'd witnessed this afternoon was not a trick, and not luck, and not an anomaly, but a skill so thorough and so specific that it made the things they'd thought they knew about horses feel suddenly approximate. Luke latched the transport gate and looked at Harper. What happens now, with him I mean, after Martha's paddock? I work with him, Harper said. Every day, as much as he needs. And then... She looked at the transport for a moment. There's a Pendleton exhibition in 6 weeks. Regional show. Prize money significant. Luke stared at her. You're planning to show him. I'm planning to give him the chance to show what he actually is, she said. which isn't what anybody on this ranch decided he was. That's, Luke started, then stopped. That's either very brave or very... Either way, Harper said, it's what I'm doing. She climbed up to take the reins. The wagon creaked and shifted. The afternoon light was going amber by now, the way Wyoming light does in July, turning everything it touches a color just between gold and sorrow. Harper held the reins with her hands loose and her back straight and her face forward. She was not thinking about Ethan Kincaid's expression at the fence, the way it had moved through surprise and calculation into something harder to categorize. She was not thinking about Rourke Malloy's voice going quiet in the particular way that meant she had not heard the last of him. She was thinking about a 6-week window and a horse who had just taken the first real breath of his life on this ranch. And she was thinking about her father. And she was thinking that she had exactly enough and not one thing more to make this work. The transport rolled out of the Kincaid spread and onto the Millhaven Road, and behind her, the East Corral stood empty for the first time in 6 months, and the dust her wheels raised hung in the amber light like something refusing to settle. Like a question left open in the air, waiting to see what kind of answer was coming. Martha Pritchard was waiting at the paddock gate when Harper pulled in. She was 63 years old and had the build of a woman who had been carrying heavy things for a long time, and had simply decided at some point that this was fine, that this was just what life felt like, and had organized her personality around that acceptance without bitterness. She had flour on her left wrist from the evening's baking, and she was wearing her apron, which meant she'd left the diner in the middle of service to be here, which was not a small thing. She looked at the transport. She looked at Harper. "Well," she said. "Well," Harper said, "you actually did it." "I did." Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father would have been unbearable about this. He would have talked about it for a month." Harper's throat tightened in a way she hadn't expected. "Yeah," she managed. "He would have." Martha opened the paddock gate and stood back while Harper brought Ashbreaker down the ramp. The horse's hooves found the grass, and he stood there for a moment with his head up and his ears moving through the evening sounds. Crickets starting the diner's kitchen noise from 40 yards away. A dog somewhere in town, and he looked like something trying to remember what it was like to be in a place where the air didn't hurt. "He's beautiful," Martha said quietly. "He is." Harper agreed. "What did Kincaid say? When you actually walked out with him?" Harper thought about it. About the expression on Ethan Kincaid's face. About the dollar bill held up in the amber light. About the word yes delivered in a tone she didn't have a complete translation for yet. "Not much," she said. But the way he didn't say it was interesting. Martha looked at her sideways. "Harper Jane Lane," she said in the particular voice she used when she was about to say something important that she was going to frame as something else. "You were at that ranch for 3 hours and you came back with a horse and an observation about a man's tone of voice. Now I am not going to say anything about that." "Good," Harper said. "I'm just going to note it," Martha said, "and then say nothing further." "Appreciated," Harper said. Ashbreaker took 3 steps forward into the paddock and lowered his head to the grass. Martha watched him for a moment. Then she said more quietly, "You're planning on the Pendleton show, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," Harper said. 6 weeks. 6 weeks, Harper confirmed. Martha exhaled through her nose. "Rourke Malloy is going to be a problem." "I know. Ethan Kincaid is... I don't know what Ethan Kincaid is going to be yet," Martha said carefully. "I've known that man for 15 years, and I still can't always predict which version of him shows up." "Which versions are there?" Harper asked. Martha considered. "There's the one who built that ranch from nothing through pure stubbornness, and is very proud of what that cost him, and intends to keep paying that cost for the rest of his life, because it's the only way he knows how to live. And there's the one that shows up every once in a while when something surprises him, and that version is different, quieter, more like a person and less like a position." She paused. "You surprised him today." "I can tell," Harper said. "The question," Martha said, "is what he does with that." Harper looked at Ashbreaker moving slowly through the paddock in the evening light, unhurried, tentative, a creature learning in real time what it felt like to be somewhere that wasn't against him. "That's his business," Harper said. "I've got enough of my own." But even as she said it, she was aware in the way that you're aware of a sound, just at the edge of hearing, that Ethan Kincaid, and the particular look on his face at that corral fence, had taken up residence in some part of her attention that she had not assigned it to and was not sure what to do with. She stayed with Ashbreaker until full dark. She brought water. She brought a bit of grain from the bag she'd had Luke load in the transport. She sat on the top rail of the paddock fence and talked to him, not any particular thing, just words, her own voice in the dark, something steady and present and human in the Wyoming night. He came to stand near her after about an hour, not close enough to touch, just near. Which was, she knew everything, which was right now the whole world. Somewhere across town, in the office of the Kincaid Spread's main house, Ethan Kincaid was sitting at his desk with a dollar bill held between two fingers, looking at it the way a man looks at something that doesn't fit the category he's been trying to put it in all day. And across the desk from him, his chair pulled up with the particular ease of a man who makes himself at home in other people's offices, because he has decided it's his right. Rourke Malloy was saying, "That girl is going to be a problem, Ethan. What happened today was a trick, a good one, but it doesn't hold. And when that horse goes sideways again, and he will, it's going to be your property and your liability that gets cited, regardless of who that dollar bill says owns him." Ethan set the dollar down on the desk. He looked at it for a moment. "She's not a girl," he said. Rourke paused. "Excuse me, she's 26 years old," Ethan said. "She handled a horse in 6 hours that you couldn't handle in 6 months. She's not a girl." The silence between them had a new texture. "I know you don't like being shown up." Ethan continued, still looking at the dollar. "I don't either particularly. But what I saw today in that corral was either luck or skill, and it wasn't luck. Which means we've had the wrong approach to that animal from the beginning. Which means—" He stopped, picked the dollar up, put it in his desk drawer. "That's worth thinking about." Rourke stood up from the chair. His voice, when he spoke, was perfectly level, perfectly professional, perfectly empty of everything that was actually in it. "I'll give you my thoughts on the Pendleton exhibition logistics by end of week." "Good," Ethan said. "That's all." Rourke walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "She won't be ready in 6 weeks," he said. Not aggressively, almost pleasantly. "Neither of them will. And when that becomes obvious, I'd rather we'd made a different decision today." He left before Ethan could answer. Ethan sat in the office alone. He opened the desk drawer and looked at the dollar bill lying there in the lamplight. He thought about the sound that had come out of that corral this afternoon, the humming, the specific low pattern of it, old and unhurried and entirely unintimidated by the situation it was being used in. He thought about the way the stallion's ear had turned. He thought about a woman sitting in the dust of his east corral, like she owned the ground she was sitting on. He closed the drawer. Outside, the Wyoming night had settled full over Millhaven, and somewhere on the south end of town, a light was on in a paddock that hadn't needed a light in years. 6 weeks is both a very long time and no time at all, depending on what you're trying to build inside it. Harper learned this the way she learned most things, not as a theory, but as a physical fact lived through the body, absorbed through the hands. The first week with Ashbreaker was not dramatic. It was not the kind of progress that made for a good story. It was slow and repetitive and unglamorous, and it required her to show up at the paddock before sunrise every single morning, still in her diner uniform half the time, because her shift started at 6, and Martha's paddock was only 10 minutes from the kitchen door, and 10 minutes was enough. She didn't ride him that first week. She didn't try to. She just spent time near him working around the paddock, moving equipment, carrying things, making herself a consistent presence in his world that always resulted in the same outcome. No harm, no escalation, no pressure that didn't have a clear, predictable endpoint. By day 4, he was coming to the fence when she arrived. Not because she'd trained him to, because he'd decided to. That distinction was everything. Martha watched from the back porch of the diner some mornings, holding her coffee with both hands, not saying anything. She had the good sense to understand that what was happening in that paddock didn't need commentary. It needed witnesses. So she witnessed it, and she kept the coffee hot for when Harper came in, and she didn't ask questions that didn't need answering. The town, however, had plenty of questions. Word had moved through Millhaven, the way word always moved through a small town, faster than it should have, slightly distorted from the original and trailing implications that nobody had explicitly stated, but everyone had managed to hear. By Wednesday, the story at the barber shop was that a diner waitress had walked onto Kincaid's spread and handled a killer horse with her bare hands. By Thursday, the version circulating at the general store had added details nobody had actually witnessed, including a claim that she'd whispered something in the horse's ear that had stopped him mid-charge. By Friday morning, 3 separate people had approached Martha's counter to ask whether it was true that Harper Lane had been fired from the ranch because she'd embarrassed Ethan Kincaid in front of his own crew. Martha corrected this version with the flat efficiency of a woman who had been correcting Millhaven's misapprehensions for 30 years. She was never employed by Kincaid, Martha said to the third person who asked. She went there, she made a deal, she kept it. She left with a horse. That's the whole story. But what was she doing there in the first place? The woman at the counter pressed. What business does a waitress have walking up to Ethan Kincaid's ranch and making deals? Martha looked at her for a long moment. The same business anybody has making a deal, she said. She had something to offer. He had something she wanted. They made an arrangement. I'd think you'd find that straightforward. She refilled the coffee without being asked and moved down the counter, and her tone made it clear that she considered the subject addressed. But the woman turned to the person beside her and said in a voice just low enough to be pointed, I don't know what she thinks she's going to do with that animal. Somebody ought to tell her that knowing a little bit about horses doesn't make you a horse trainer. Harper, coming in through the kitchen door with hay still on her sleeves, heard exactly none of this. She was thinking about the way Ashbreaker had extended his trot that morning for the first time, without shortening back into anxiety, long clean strides, ears forward, weight balanced, and the specific quality of pride that had moved through her at that private and uncomplicated, like a sound heard only inside. The second week brought the first real test. It came from an unexpected direction, the way the significant ones usually do. She was working Ashbreaker in the paddock on a Tuesday morning late because the breakfast rush had run long, and she hadn't gotten out of the diner until nearly 9 when she heard a horse and rider coming up the road from the direction of Kincaid's spread. She knew the sound of the Kincaid horses. She'd heard them enough times over the years passing through town that the rhythm of their stride had its own recognizable quality. She kept working, kept her attention on Ashbreaker. The rider stopped at the paddock fence. Ethan Kincaid sat his horse with the particular ease of a man who had been riding since before he could remember and didn't think about it any more than he thought about breathing. He watched her for a moment without announcing himself, which she found when she registered his presence, either rude or careful, and she wasn't sure which. "How's he doing?" Ethan said. Not a question exactly, more like an opening. "Well," Harper said without stopping what she was doing, "I can see that." She brought Ashbreaker to a halt and turned to face the fence. "Is there something you needed, Mr. Kincaid?" "I was in town," he said. She waited. "Checking on a feed delivery," he added. Harper said. The word was entirely neutral and communicated nothing. Something shifted in Ethan's expression, a brief, involuntary thing, like a man who has realized mid-sentence that his reasoning sounds less convincing out loud than it did in his head. "He's moving differently," he said, nodding at Ashbreaker. "More settled through the hindquarters." Harper looked at him for a moment, then back at the horse. "Yes," she said. "What changed?" "Nothing sudden," she said. "That's the point. Nothing sudden and nothing unpredictable. He knows what to expect now, so he can stop spending all his energy managing the uncertainty and actually use it for something." Ethan was quiet for a beat. That's a philosophy as much as a method. Most things that actually work are, she said. He sat there on his horse for a moment longer, and Harper had the distinct impression that he'd come out here with more to say than he'd managed to say, and was now weighing whether to say it or file it back under whatever heading he'd been keeping it under. He filed it. "I'll let you get back to it," he said. "Thank you for stopping by," she said, and the politeness was genuine, but also served as a door closing. He rode back toward town. Harper watched him go for 2 seconds, then turned back to Ashbreaker. Martha from the back porch had witnessed the entire exchange with the expression of a woman reading a book she's read before and knows exactly how it ends. She said nothing. She went inside and put more coffee on. The third week was when Rourke Malloy made his first direct move, and he did it in the way that Harper had already suspected he would not openly not, in a way that could be cleanly identified and opposed, but sideways. Indirectly. Through channels. It started with the Pendleton exhibition registration. Harper had gone to submit her entry on a Thursday afternoon riding Ashbreaker into town for only the second time. He'd handled the first trip well enough that she'd decided he was ready for a second, and he'd moved through the street noise and the other horses, and the general busy chaos of Millhaven's main road, with the particular composure of an animal who has recently recalibrated what the world costs him. The man at the exhibition desk was named Clarence Hobbs, and he was the kind of man who managed small domains with the energy of someone managing large ones. He looked at her entry form with an expression that went from neutral to careful in the time it took him to read her name. "Harper Lane," he said. "That's right. From Martha Pritchard's diner." "I work there, yes." He set the form down and picked up a different paper from a stack beside him. He consulted it, put it down. "There's actually, there may be an issue with the registration." Harper looked at him steadily. "What kind of issue?" "The horse you've listed," Clarence said. "Ashbreaker, former Kincaid property." "Currently my property," Harper said. "I have the bill of sale of—" "Yes, I understand that, but there's a question that's been raised about the horse's fitness for exhibition, given his history." Clarence had the particular discomfort of a man delivering a message he didn't write. "There's been a concern filed with the exhibition committee about public safety." "Who filed it?" Harper asked. Clarence looked at his paper. He looked at Harper. He looked at his paper again. I'm not at liberty to—" "Who filed it, Mr. Hobbs?" He exhaled. "The concern was raised by Mr. Malloy, on behalf of the Kincaid spread. The paddock 3 weeks ago." Rourke's voice going flat and pleasant. "She won't be ready in 6 weeks. Neither of them will." Harper kept her face very still. "The horse is registered in my name," she said. "The concern was filed by a person with no current legal standing regarding this animal." "On what grounds can the committee decline a valid registration?" "They can't technically," Clarence said, and the relief in his voice at being able to say something accurate was audible. "But they can request a fitness evaluation, a demonstration essentially, before the exhibition, to determine whether the animal is appropriate for a public event." "Fine," Harper said. Clarence blinked. "Fine. Schedule the evaluation," she said. "I'll be there. She picked up the partially processed form, set it back in front of him, and waited while he stamped it with hands that moved a little faster than before, as if completing the transaction quickly would prevent it from becoming more complicated. She left the registration office and stood on the boardwalk outside for a moment with her hands loose at her sides and her jaw set, and the particular internal temperature of a woman who is very angry and is choosing deliberately not to be visibly very angry right now, because visible anger would be the least efficient use of what she was feeling. Ashbreaker was tied at the post beside her. He turned his head and bumped her shoulder once with his nose. She exhaled. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." She untied him and swung up into the saddle. She rode to Luke Mercer's boarding house because Luke was the only person at the Kincaid spread who had told her the truth voluntarily, and without being asked, and she needed someone who had been inside that situation to tell her what she was actually dealing with. Luke came to the door still in his work clothes, which meant he'd just gotten back from the spread. He took one look at her expression and said, What happened? Rourke filed a fitness concern with the Pendleton Committee, she said, against Ashbreaker's exhibition registration. Luke said a word under his breath that he immediately followed with an apology. Don't apologize, Harper said. I agree with you. Come in, he said. Sit down. She sat. He remained standing, which was his habit when he was thinking. He paced slightly short movements like he was working something out in his feet. He can't block the registration outright, Luke said. The horse is yours. He doesn't have legal grounds. He's not trying to block it, Harper said. He's trying to create doubt, get the committee nervous, get people talking about safety, make it so that even if I pass the evaluation, there's a story running in the background about whether I should be there. Luke stopped pacing. That's exactly what that is. Is Ethan behind it? The question sat in the room between them. Luke took a while to answer. Rourke doesn't usually act independently on anything that touches ranch reputation, he said carefully. But I also know Ethan wasn't happy about how I read the conversation in his office 2 weeks ago. He told Rourke to back off. Rourke doesn't always interpret backing off the way Ethan intends it. So maybe yes, maybe no, Harper said. Maybe yes, maybe no, Luke confirmed. But Harper... He hesitated. If it's Rourke acting on his own and Ethan finds out, Ethan finding out doesn't help me with the evaluation next week, she said. No, Luke said, but it might help you with what comes after. She thought about Ethan Kincaid at the paddock fence, the way he'd sat his horse and watched Ashbreaker move and said that's a philosophy as much as a method, and meant it as something other than criticism. The way he'd filed something back under whatever heading he was keeping it under and ridden away. She thought about Martha saying the version of him that gets surprised is different, quieter, more like a person and less like a position. One thing at a time, Harper said. She went back to the paddock that evening and worked until the light was gone. She wasn't working toward the evaluation exactly. She was working because Ashbreaker needed the consistency, needed the daily confirmation that this world he was cautiously beginning to trust was still there when he woke up and still there when the sun went down. But she was also aware underneath that of a more urgent quality to the evening's work. A tightening, a feeling of time becoming something with edges. 3 days before the evaluation, Ethan Kincaid came to the paddock again. This time, he didn't pretend he was there for a feed delivery. He tied his horse at the post and came to stand at the fence and watched her work for a full 5 minutes before he spoke. She could feel him watching. She worked through it. Ashbreaker could feel it too. She felt the slight shift in his attention, the brief check of his stride, and she steadied him with her seat, and he settled back. When she brought him to a halt near the fence, Ethan said, "I didn't know about the committee filing." Harper looked at him. "I want to be clear about that," he said. "That was Rourke, not an instruction I gave." "All right," she said. "I told him to stand down," Ethan said. "This morning, directly. Did he agree?" A pause. "Rourke doesn't disagree with me directly," Ethan said. "Whether he agrees is a different question." Harper dismounted and stood on the near side of Ashbreaker with one hand on his neck. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I should have," Ethan said. "Before you found out from Clarence Hobbs." The admission was small, but it landed with the particular weight of something that cost the person saying it. Harper recognized the weight. She'd grown up watching her father navigate exactly this kind of male economy, where the acknowledgement of a misstep had to be measured carefully against the cost to the structure of authority that surrounded it. "The evaluation is Friday," she said. "I know. I don't need anything from you for it," she said. "I just need you to make sure your foreman doesn't interfere with what's already been agreed to." "I'll be there Friday," Ethan said. That surprised her. "Why?" He looked at her straight. "Because I want to see it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then, "That's your business," she said. "But don't bring Rourke." Something moved through his expression. Not amusement, not quite, but adjacent to it. The look of a man who recognizes that he's just been given an instruction by someone with no formal authority to give it, and finds himself inclined to comply anyway, and is quietly baffled by that inclination. "All right," he said. He untied his horse, then stopped, turned back. "Your father," he said. "Bill Lane. He had a parcel out on the Flat Creek Road." "Yes," she said carefully. "He was a good horseman," Ethan said. "I bought 2 horses from him about 6 years ago, before things got difficult for him." He paused. "They were good horses, both of them." Harper's throat tightened in the way it did when something came at her sideways from a direction she hadn't been covering. "I didn't know that," she said. "I don't imagine he would have mentioned it," Ethan said. "It wasn't a large transaction, but they were good horses. I remember thinking at the time that the man selling them knew what he was doing." He settled his hat. "I see where you come by it." He rode away before she could answer. She stood at the fence with her hand on Ashbreaker's neck and the evening coming in around the edges of the day, and she felt the back of her eyes go hot in a way she hadn't anticipated and hadn't prepared for, and she kept her face forward and her jaw still, and she breathed through it until it passed. He knew what he was doing. 6 years ago, her father had been alive and healthy and selling horses, and people like Ethan Kincaid had looked at the transaction and registered it, however briefly, as the work of a man who knew his craft. She had carried that craft in her hands all the way to a dollar bet in a stranger's yard, and she had not dropped it, and she was not going to drop it now. Friday came. The evaluation was held at the Millhaven Livestock Yard on the north edge of town in front of a 3-man exhibition committee that included Clarence Hobbs and 2 ranchers Harper recognized by sight but didn't know personally. There were also, she noticed as she rode Ashbreaker through the gate, a significant number of people who had not been officially invited to a committee evaluation and were present anyway, standing along the fence positioned at the yard's perimeter, doing the thing that small towns do when something worth watching is happening, which is show up and watch it. Ethan Kincaid was there, alone, standing slightly apart from the crowd at the fence exactly as he'd said he would be. Rourke Malloy was not there. Harper noted both of these facts and put them aside. The committee chairman, one of the 2 ranchers, a man named Aldrich with a gray beard, and the slow, deliberate movement of someone who had been making livestock assessments for 40 years, walked to the center of the yard and addressed her directly. "Miss Lane, you understand the purpose of this evaluation." "I do," she said. "We need to see the animal perform basic exhibition work without incident. Controlled gait's directional response, appropriate behavior in a mixed environment." He gestured at the other horses and people around the yard. "If he shows signs of being a danger to himself, to you, or to any bystander, we'll halt the evaluation and the registration will be reviewed." "Understood," Harper said. "Whenever you're ready," Aldrich said, and stepped back. The yard went quiet in that particular way that spaces go quiet when everyone in them has decided to pay full attention. Harper walked Ashbreaker forward, and Ashbreaker, the horse that had put 2 men in the doctor's office, the horse that Rourke Malloy had managed with chains and starvation and rope, the horse that had screamed against steel fencing, like something the world had already broken, walked into that evaluation with his ears forward and his stride even, and his breathing steady, and he did everything Harper asked of him with the quiet, grounded confidence of a creature who has recently been reminded that the world can be navigated without constant bracing for impact. The walk was clean. The trot was clean. She took him through directional changes and halts, and a controlled lope in both directions, and he responded to each cue with the particular quality that good training produces. Not mechanical compliance, but genuine engagement, a horse and rider reading each other in real time. At the 7-minute mark, a dog broke loose from somewhere at the fence and shot across the edge of the yard barking. 3 horses nearby shied hard. One rider nearly came off. Ashbreaker startled one sharp sideways step and then settled, immediately. Under her seat and her voice and the relationship they had built across 23 consecutive mornings in a paddock on the south end of town, he settled. She heard someone at the fence exhale. She brought him back to a walk, completed the circuit, halted in front of Aldrich. The committee chairman looked at her. He looked at the horse. He looked at his two colleagues, who both gave him a nod that was nearly imperceptible, but clear enough. "Registration confirmed," Aldrich said. "Exhibition entry stands." The crowd at the fence made a sound. Not a cheer, exactly more, a collective release of held breath that took the form of approval. Harper kept her face calm. She kept her hands easy on the reins. She gave Ashbreaker one long, slow stroke along his neck. "Thank you," she said to Aldrich. She rode toward the gate. Ethan Kincaid was standing right at the fence where the gate opened, and she would have to pass directly in front of him to exit. She didn't alter her path. As she passed, he said quietly and without fanfare, "Your father would be proud." She didn't stop riding, but she said equally quietly, looking straight ahead, "I know." She rode out of the livestock yard and back toward Martha's paddock, and behind her, Millhaven did what small towns do with things they've witnessed. It picked the story up and began carrying it forward, turning it over, adding it to the pile of things it knew or thought it knew about its own people. And in the Millhaven livestock yard, Ethan Kincaid stood at the fence for a moment after she'd gone alone with the particular expression of a man who is running a calculation. He didn't expect to be running about a person he didn't expect to be thinking about this carefully and finding that the numbers keep coming out the same, no matter how he approaches them. 3 weeks until the Pendleton exhibition. Somewhere across town, Rourke Malloy was hearing about the evaluation results from Clarence Hobbs, and the way his expression arranged itself when he heard them was not the expression of a man who was finished. It was the expression of a man who was recalculating. And that Harper would have told you, if you'd asked her, was the part she was most paying attention to. 3 weeks felt like 3 days. Harper learned this the same way she'd learned everything else in the last month and a half. Not as a concept, but as a physical fact that arrived without warning and settled in her chest like a stone. One morning, she was riding Ashbreaker through his extended trot in Martha's paddock and thinking she had time, and then she blinked, and it was the week before the Pendleton exhibition, and time had closed around her like a hand. The work had been good. That was the truth of it underneath everything else. Whatever was coming, whatever Rourke was planning, whatever Ethan Kincaid was or wasn't doing with whatever he was feeling underneath all of that, the work had been genuinely, quietly good. Ashbreaker had become across 41 consecutive mornings, something that nobody on the Kincaid spread would have recognized as the same animal. Not because Harper had changed who he was, because she'd stopped requiring him to be someone different in order to survive. He was fast. She'd known he would be. She'd read it in his structure from the first day, the way his hindquarters were built for propulsion, the length of his stride, the angle of his shoulder. But she hadn't fully understood how fast until she'd let him open up across the flat ground behind the diner property on a clear morning in week 4. And the speed had come out of him like something that had been waiting a very long time for permission. Clean and powerful, and without a trace of the anxious, explosive energy that had made him dangerous before. This was different. This was a horse running because he wanted to, because the ground felt good under him and the air was moving and nothing was chasing him. She'd pulled him back to a canter and sat there for a moment with her eyes stinging from the wind, and something she didn't have an exact word for moving through her chest. Her father would have said that right there is what a horse looks like when it's telling the truth. She told Martha about it over breakfast that morning, and Martha listened with both hands around her coffee cup and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Your daddy used to say you could tell everything about a person's character by what they do with something that's been hurt." Harper looked at her. "He said it about horses," Martha clarified, "but he meant it wider than that." Harper looked back at her plate. "He talked about you a lot, you know," Martha said, "in the last months, when he was too tired to come in himself, and he'd send you with the weekly order. He'd stop by after sometimes I think just to talk to somebody who'd seen you. He was proud of you in a way he didn't always know how to say directly." Harper put her fork down. "Martha," she said quietly. "I know," Martha said. "I just think you should know that somebody knew what you were worth before any of this happened, before the horse and the dollar and the whole business. She stood up and took her cup to the counter. "That's all I'm saying." Harper sat at that table for 2 full minutes before she trusted herself to stand up and get back to work. The problem with Rourke came on a Wednesday 5 days before the exhibition, and it came in the form of a sound. Harper heard it before she understood what it was. A sharp, rhythmic impact from somewhere near the far end of the paddock fence, too regular to be accidental, too deliberate to be anything except a decision. She came around the corner of the diner outbuilding and found 2 men she didn't recognize doing something to the paddock fence post on the north end. Not breaking it, not obviously, just working at it. With something that wasn't a repair tool. She stopped walking. One of the men looked up, saw her, said something to the other man. They moved away from the post with the practiced casualness of people who have been interrupted doing something they've calculated they can deny. "What are you doing?" Harper said. "Just passing through," the first man said. He was maybe 30 lean, with the kind of even expression that sits on a face when someone has decided in advance that they are not going to admit to anything. "This is private property," she said. "Martha Pritchard's property." "Road's right there," the second man said, gesturing vaguely at nothing. "The road," Harper said, "is 40 yards that way." "What were you doing at this fence post?" Neither man answered. They walked. She watched them go all the way to the road and turn north, and she stood there until they were out of sight, before she went to the fence post and looked at what they'd done. The base had been partially cut. Not enough to cause immediate failure, not enough to fall down today or tomorrow, or maybe even this week. But enough that under significant lateral pressure, the kind of pressure a frightened horse generates when it hits a fence at speed, the post would go. And the post going would take the rail with it, and a gap in a fence on the night before an exhibition in the dark, with a horse that had spent months learning the world was safe, could undo 41 mornings of work in under 60 seconds. She looked at the post for a long time. Then she went inside and found Martha. She didn't say Rourke's name. She didn't know for certain it was Rourke, except that she did know with the specific certainty of a person who has been paying the right kind of attention, the way her father had taught her to pay attention, the way you learn to read what an animal's history has written on its body. She knew the way you know a storm is coming before the sky shows you anything visible. "I need to move him," she said. "Tonight, somewhere they don't know about." Martha didn't ask who they were. "Elijah Boone's livery," she said immediately. "South Side. Elijah's been the sheriff here for 11 years, and nobody messes with his property without consequences they can see coming. Will Elijah Boone has disliked Rourke Malloy for going on 4 years, Martha said. "Give me 20 minutes. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Elijah Boone was at the paddock fence, looking at the cut post with his hat pushed back on his head, and an expression that had moved from neutral to something much colder and more specific. He was a tall man, spare with a quietness to him that wasn't emptiness. It was more like a full glass, held very steady. Nothing wasted, nothing spilled. He'd been the law in Millhaven since 1879, and he'd lasted because he was the kind of man who kept excellent track of who had done what to whom, and maintained a very clear internal ledger about which debts had been settled and which hadn't. He crouched down and looked at the cut, ran his thumb along the edge of it, stood back up. "Fresh," he said. "Within the last 2 hours," Harper said. "You didn't see their faces clearly." "Clearly enough to know I hadn't seen them before," she said. "And clearly enough to know they'd been sent rather than arrived on their own initiative." Boone looked at her. "That's a significant accusation with lean evidence." "I'm not making an accusation," Harper said. "I'm asking you to hold my horse in your livery for 5 days. He considered this." "That I can do." He looked at the post again. "I'll also be having a conversation with Rourke Malloy tomorrow morning that he's going to find uncomfortable." "You don't have to do that on my account," Harper said. "I'm not," Boone said. "I'm doing it on account of someone damaging Martha Pritchard's property, which is something I take personally, regardless of the circumstance." He reset his hat. "Get the horse. I'll walk with you." They moved Ashbreaker to the sheriff's livery as the evening came in, and he loaded without fuss, which still moved something in Harper every time it happened. The simple, unremarkable fact of a horse that trusted the process that had learned the world wasn't always lying to him. Boone walked alongside her and didn't talk much. He had the rare quality of understanding when silence was company enough. As they reached the livery and she settled Ashbreaker into a clean stall, Boone stood at the stall door and said, "I saw the evaluation 3 weeks ago." "I didn't see you there," Harper said. "I wasn't at the fence," he said. "I was at the back." She looked at him. "That horse," Boone said, "is not the same animal that was on the Kincaid spread." He said it slowly, as if he were still working out what to do with the observation. "I've seen horses come back from hard treatment before. I've never seen one come back like that." "He didn't come back," Harper said. "He came forward. That's different." Boone thought about this. "Yeah," he said. "I suppose it is." He left her there with the horse. She stayed until late. The next morning, Ethan Kincaid came to find her at the diner. Not the paddock, the diner itself. He came through the front door during the mid-morning lull when the breakfast rush was over and the lunch crowd hadn't started, and he sat down at the counter with his hat in his hands, the way a man sits when he's there to say something specific and is organizing how to say it. Harper refilled the cup of the customer at the far end of the counter before she came to him. She didn't rush. She poured his coffee and set the pot down and waited. "Rourke resigned this morning," Ethan said. She went very still. "I confronted him about the fence post," Ethan said. He didn't deny it. He didn't admit to it either, but he didn't deny it, which is Rourke's particular way of telling the truth. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I told him he was done." Harper looked at him. "Did he go quietly?" "Rourke Malloy doesn't do anything quietly," Ethan said. "But he went." The diner was very still around them. The cook was in the kitchen, and the only other customer was at the far end with his back to them, and the ordinary morning sounds of Millhaven were moving through the windows, and none of it seemed entirely real for a moment. "I owe you an apology," Ethan said, "for the committee filing. I should have shut that down faster. I knew what he was doing, and I handled it slower than I should have." "Why did you?" Harper asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. He looked at his coffee. "Because I wasn't sure," he said, "about what I was dealing with. What about the situation?" He stopped, tried again. "You came onto my property with $1 and a certainty I didn't understand, and you turned out to be right, and there's a version of me that found that not convenient." "Because it meant you'd been wrong," she said. "Because it meant I'd been wrong," he confirmed. "About the horse, about the approach, possibly about some other things." He said that last part with the particular economy of a man who is being more specific than his words suggest, and knows the other person knows it. Harper looked at him for a long moment. "Apology accepted," she said. Something in his posture shifted not dramatically, just a degree or two of tension leaving. "The exhibition is Saturday," he said. "It is," she said. "I'd like to—" He stopped, started again. "Victoria Granger is going to be there. Texas investor considering the regional horse program. She's been to the Kincaid spread twice in the last month." He paused. "She heard about what happened, with Ashbreaker, with the evaluation." Harper waited. "She wants to meet you," Ethan said. The information sat between them like a card laid face up on a table. "Why are you telling me this?" Harper asked. "Because it's information you should have," he said, "before Saturday, so you're not walking into it without knowing the full picture." She studied him. The careful way he'd constructed the sentence. The thing underneath it that he wasn't quite saying which was, that he wanted her to walk into Saturday knowing the full picture because he cared what happened to her there, and he was not yet at a point where he could say that without it being a thing he'd said with all that would follow from saying it. She recognized the position. She was in a version of it herself. "Thank you," she said. And then because it was true, and because he deserved to hear it, for dealing with Rourke. "I should have dealt with him 6 months ago," Ethan said. "Long before any of this." Martha appeared from the kitchen with a plate that hadn't been ordered, and set it in front of Ethan, with the serene authority of a woman who has decided that a man sitting at her counter with his hat in his hands needs feeding. Ethan looked at the plate, looked at Martha. "I didn't eat," Martha said pleasantly. "You look like you've been having a difficult morning." He ate. Harper moved back down the counter to her other customers, and Martha watched Ethan Kincaid eat his eggs with the expression of a woman reading a book she's read before, and she allowed herself privately a very small and satisfied smile. The rest of the week moved at the particular speed of time when you're waiting for something significant. Harper worked ashbreaker every morning in Boone's livery yard, keeping the rhythm consistent, keeping everything as close to normal as she could manage, because the one thing she understood absolutely was that the exhibition was not going to go well on adrenaline and hope. It was going to go well because 41 mornings of consistency had built something reliable, and reliable didn't break under pressure. It was what you had left after everything unreliable had burned off. Luke Mercer came to watch on Thursday morning. He stood at the livery fence and watched them work for 40 minutes without saying anything, which was how she knew he was worried. "Say it," she said when she brought Ashbreaker to a halt in front of him. "Rourke left the Kincaid spread yesterday," Luke said. "But Rourke leaving and Rourke being gone are different things. He still lives in the county. He still has people, relationships. There are 3 men who worked under him on that spread for years who left with him or shortly after." "You think he's not finished," Harper said. "I think," Luke said carefully, "that a man like Rourke doesn't lose publicly and walk away clean. It's not in his nature." The fence post was when he thought he still had something to manage quietly. Now that he's been fired and it's public. He stopped. "I think Saturday needs to be handled carefully." "I'm always careful," Harper said. "I know," Luke said. "I mean, the people around you need to be careful. Boone's going to be at the exhibition he goes every year. Martha's going, obviously. I'm going." He paused. "Ethan's going to be there." "I know," Harper said. Luke looked at her. There was something in his expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. "He's different," Luke said. "Since all of this, around the spread. I don't know how to say it exactly. He's been asking questions he didn't used to ask. About the horses. About why certain approaches work and others don't. He pulled out Rourke's training records last week and went through them. All of them." He paused. He didn't say anything after, but he had a look on his face that I'd describe as a man finding out he'd been lied to by someone he trusted and rearranging everything he built on top of that lie. Harper absorbed this. "He told me he'd been wrong about some things," she said. "He said that—" Luke looked genuinely startled. "In his way," she said. "Yeah." Luke was quiet for a moment. "That's Harper. Ethan Kincaid has not said those words in combination in the 7 years I've worked for him." She didn't say anything to that. She thought about it, though. She thought about it while she cooled Ashbreaker down and cleaned his hooves and ran her hands down his legs the way she did every morning, checking, confirming, staying connected to the physical reality of what they'd built. She thought about it the way you think about something that's taken up residence in the part of your mind you'd allocated for other things and simply moved in without asking. Friday night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed above Martha's diner and listened to the sounds of the town settling into its nighttime version of itself, and she thought about her father. Not the last months she'd spent enough time there. She thought about earlier. About the morning when she was 9 years old, and he'd put her up on a horse for the first time, and then stood back and not said a word, just watched her figure it out. And when she'd gotten the horse to move in the direction she wanted without being shown how, he'd said from 15 feet away, just quietly, "There you go." That was all. "There you go." Like it was the most natural thing in the world that she'd find it. She got up before 4 and went down to the livery and sat with Ashbreaker in the dark for an hour. Just sat. No working, no goals. She brought him a bit of apple that Martha had put aside, and she sat on the stall rail, and he stood near her, and the town was completely quiet around them, and the night smelled like hay and horses, and the particular sweetness of Wyoming summer in the last hours before dawn. She talked to him. She told him what Saturday was. She told him what was at stake and what wasn't, what actually mattered, and what she'd decided to let go of. She told him about her father. She told him about the horse her father had brought back, the one the whole county had written off, the one that followed him across a field without a lead rope. She said, "You and me, that's all this is. Everything else is just noise." Ashbreaker bumped her shoulder with his nose. She pressed her forehead against the side of his face. "I know," she said. "I know." She was still there when the first gray of dawn came through the livery door. She straightened, looked at him, his even breathing, the calm attention in his eye. The stillness that was not emptiness but presence. The particular peace of a creature that had learned slowly and with difficulty, and through the consistent patience of one person who refused to give up on him, that the world was survivable, more than survivable. She took a slow breath. Tomorrow was Saturday, and somewhere across town, in the office of a man who had spent 7 years trusting the wrong person, and was only now understanding the full scope of what that had cost a lamp, was burning late into the Friday night, and Ethan Kincaid was sitting at his desk, not looking at any of the papers in front of him, thinking about a woman who had handed him $1 and changed everything, and wondering in the specific private way of a man who has held himself apart from things for a very long time, what exactly he was going to do about that. Saturday arrived the way important days always do, without ceremony, without any particular announcement. Just the ordinary light of morning coming through an ordinary window, and the sound of a town waking up that didn't know yet what it was waking up for. Harper was already dressed when the light came. She'd slept 3 hours, maybe 4, and she felt it in her eyes and in the back of her neck. But she'd learned long ago that tired and unready were different conditions, and she was only one of them. She braided her hair with hands that didn't shake. She laced her boots, the new ones Martha had put on the counter 3 days ago. Without comment, just set them there and walked back into the kitchen, and Harper had stood looking at them for a long moment before she picked them up. Good leather. Proper sole. The kind of boots a person wore when they intended to be taken seriously. She went to the livery before breakfast. Ashbreaker heard her coming. She knew because he moved to the front of the stall before she opened the door. Not anxious, not agitated, just alert. Present. The way he'd learned to be when she arrived, which was the way of a creature that has decided someone's approach is worth orienting toward. She stood at the stall door and looked at him for a moment. "Today," she said. He blinked. "You and me," she said. "Like I told you." She spent an hour with him before she ate anything. Brushing, checking, moving through every part of their morning routine, with the same unhurried consistency she'd maintained for 42 days, because today was not the day to change anything. Today was the day all those unchanged mornings paid out. When she finally came back through Martha's kitchen door, Martha was standing at the stove with her back to the door, and she said without turning around, "Sit down, eat something, and don't tell me you're not hungry, because I know what your face looks like when you're lying." Harper sat down and ate. Martha sat across from her with her own coffee and didn't fill the silence with anything except presence, which was its own kind of language, the one Martha had always spoken best. "Ethan sent a message last night," Martha said after a while. Harper looked up. "He wanted me to know that he'd spoken to Sheriff Boone and that Boone would have 2 deputies at the exhibition grounds from early morning." Martha paused. "He didn't say why. He didn't have to." Harper absorbed this. "He also," Martha said, looking at her coffee cup, "asked whether you had everything you needed, in terms of equipment, tack, whether there was anything the Kincaid spread could provide for today." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you had everything," Martha said, "because you do." Harper nodded. Martha looked up. "He's a complicated man," she said. "He's done some things wrong and he knows it now, and that matters. Some men never get there." She set down her cup. "I'm not telling you what to do with that. I'm just telling you it's true." "I know it's true," Harper said. "Good," Martha said, and stood up and started clearing plates, which was how she signaled that a conversation had arrived at its natural end, and they could all get on with their lives. The Pendleton Regional Exhibition drew people from 3 counties. By 8 in the morning, the exhibition grounds on the north end of Millhaven were moving with the particular organized noise of horses and people and commerce that Harper had grown up hearing as background and now heard as a context she was about to step into the center of. She rode Ashbreaker from the livery to the grounds at a walk, and she was aware, in the same way she'd been aware of everything since that first morning in the East Corral, of the quality of attention that followed them through town. People stopped. Not dramatically, just paused. Looked. Some of them she recognized people who'd eaten at Martha's counter for years and never looked at her as anything other than the person bringing their coffee. Now they were looking at her differently, and she understood what the difference was. It wasn't respect exactly, not yet. It was reconsideration. The particular look of people updating a file they'd thought was closed. She didn't perform for it. She didn't acknowledge it. She rode straight and easy and let Ashbreaker set the pace, and he walked into the exhibition grounds like he belonged there, because he did, because she had spent 6 weeks making him into a horse that belonged wherever he was placed. Luke Mercer found her at the registration check-in, appearing at her left elbow, with the slightly breathless quality of a man who had been moving fast and was pretending not to have been. "Everything all right?" she asked. "So far," he said. "Boone's here, both deputies. I've walked the perimeter." He lowered his voice. "Rourke is here." Harper's hands didn't change on the reins. "Where?" she said. "South fence. Far end. He's not doing anything yet. He's just standing there." "With anyone?" "2 men," Luke said. "I don't know their names, but I've seen them at the spread before. They left around the same time he did." Harper took this in, processed it, filed it under things she knew, and would continue watching rather than things she was going to panic about. "Tell Boone where he is," she said. "Already did." "Good." She looked at Luke directly. "You've done everything you needed to do. Now I need you to stop managing this and let me work." Luke looked like he wanted to argue. Then he looked at her face and decided against it. "Right," he said. "Yeah. Okay." He stepped back. She rode forward. The first event of the morning was not Ashbreaker's. She was in the afternoon program, which she'd known and planned for, which meant 4 hours of waiting and watching and keeping the horse calm, and herself focused in the middle of a busy, noisy, unpredictable environment. She used the time deliberately. Moved him through the crowds. Let him hear the announcements, the applause, the other horses, the dogs on leads, the children running. Every time something startled him, she steadied him and waited and let him find his own way back to calm. And every time he found it, she gave him a moment, let him feel that he'd done it himself. By noon, he was standing easy in the middle of the exhibition grounds, like he'd grown up there. Victoria Granger found Harper at 11:45. She was not what Harper had expected, though Harper would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what she had expected. Victoria Granger was perhaps 50, lean and sharp-eyed, dressed practically with the particular self-possession of a woman who had spent decades in rooms where people had underestimated her and had long since stopped finding it surprising. She looked at Ashbreaker first, then at Harper. "He was the Kincaid killer horse," she said. "No preamble. He was a horse that had been treated in a way that made him dangerous," Harper said. "That's different." "Is it?" "Very," Harper said. "One is about the animal's nature. The other is about what was done to him. The first can't be changed. The second can." Victoria studied her with the focused attention of a woman conducting an assessment. "I've been told you have no formal training." "My father trained me," Harper said, "for 17 years. He was better than anyone with a formal credential I've ever encountered." "That's a confident thing to say." "I'm a confident person," Harper said, "about the things I'm confident about. I'm not confident about everything." Something shifted in Victoria Granger's expression. Not warmth exactly, but interest sharpening. "What are you not confident about?" Harper looked at her steadily. "What comes next?" she said. "After today. I know what today is. I'm still working out what today opens up." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "There's a program," she said, "out of Austin, working with ranching operations across the region, specifically on horse handling and what I'd call reclamation. Horses that have been mishandled, written off, deemed unworkable. The program matches trainers with animals and with ranches that want a different approach." She paused. "I've been looking for someone to lead the Wyoming component of it for 8 months. Harper didn't say anything. "I'm not offering you a position right now," Victoria said clearly. "I'm telling you that I'm watching this afternoon. And that what I see this afternoon, combined with what I've already seen from the evaluation and from the account of what happened on the Kincaid spread 6 weeks ago, is going to inform a conversation I'd like to have with you on Monday." "All right," Harper said. "You're not going to ask about the money," Victoria said. It was half a statement, half a question. "You said Monday," Harper said. "I'll ask about the money on Monday." Victoria Granger looked at her for one more long moment. Then she said simply, "Good answer," and walked away. Harper turned back to Ashbreaker. "You hear that?" she said quietly. He flicked one ear in her direction. "Yeah," she said. "Me too." She was walking him along the far fence at 2 in the afternoon, keeping him loose when she felt the change. It wasn't a sound she heard first. It was a change in him, the way his head came up a degree, the way his attention shifted from the general moving noise of the exhibition to something specific targeted coming from behind and to the left. She turned in the saddle. Rourke Malloy was 30 yards away, moving through the crowd, and he wasn't alone. The 2 men Luke had described were with him, and they were moving with the particular directional purpose of people who have decided to do something and are past the point of reconsidering it. Harper assessed the situation in under 3 seconds. Rourke's eyes were on the horse, not on her, on the horse, and his right hand was holding something low against his leg, a length of chain, just a section of it. Not long, but Ashbreaker had met chain before, in a different life, in a different body almost. And she didn't know, she couldn't know with certainty how deep that particular memory was written. She pulled Ashbreaker to a halt. "Rourke," she said. Her voice came out level. She'd intended it to come out level, and it did. She was proud of that later. In the moment, she simply needed it to be a word that landed before he moved another step. He stopped. The 2 men with him stopped. "This isn't something you want to do," she said. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't threatening. She was offering information the way you offer information to someone who is about to make a decision with consequences they haven't fully calculated. "You embarrassed me," Rourke said. His voice was even, almost conversational, like a man discussing a business arrangement that had gone sideways. "In front of men I'd worked with for years, in front of Ethan. You walked onto that property with a dollar bill and you made everything I'd done look like—" "I know what I made it look like," Harper said, "because that's what it was." Rourke's jaw tightened. "What you did to that horse," she said, and her voice shifted now, not louder, but more precise, like a blade finding its edge. "What you did to him for 6 months before I ever set foot on that property that wasn't training. It wasn't management. It was cruelty with a professional title on top of it, and you knew it when you were doing it, and every man on that ranch knew it, and the reason it made you look bad is because it was bad. That's all." Rourke took a step forward. Ashbreaker moved. Not away. Not in the explosive, violent lateral surge of an animal in panic. He moved forward and to the left, placing himself between Harper and the man with the chain, and he stood there with his head up, and every line of his body arranged into something that was not aggression, but was absolutely unequivocally a statement. He had chosen a side. Rourke stopped again. Something moved through his expression that Harper had not seen there before. Not fear, not quite, but the animal-level recognition of a man who has just registered that the situation has reconfigured around him and he is no longer the largest thing in it. "Rourke Malloy." Sheriff Boone's voice came from the right, and it had that quality that voices develop after 11 years of being the last word in a room, flat and final, and carrying without being raised. Boone walked forward with both deputies flanking him and the crowd, which had been pulling back in the slow, instinctive way of crowds, when something turned serious, gave him the space to reach the center of the situation in 5 uninterrupted strides. He looked at the chain in Rourke's hand. "Put that down," he said. Rourke put it down. "Now step back." Rourke stepped back. The 2 men with him stepped back. They did it with the particular controlled compliance of people who have run a rapid calculation and arrived at an unfavorable result. Boone looked at Harper. "You all right, Boo?" "Fine," she said. The horse responded appropriately to a perceived threat. "He's settled now." "I can see that," Boone said. He looked back at Rourke. "You are going to come with me, right now, and you are going to explain to me why you are at a public exhibition with a length of chain within 30 yards of an animal and its handler, after I personally told you 3 days ago that any further interference in this matter would result in consequences you wouldn't enjoy." He paused. "Or you can give me a reason right now why I shouldn't interpret this as exactly what it looks like." Rourke said nothing. "Didn't think so," Boone said. "Move." The deputies took the 2 men. Boone walked beside Rourke. The crowd, which had compressed around the moment, slowly expanded back into its ordinary exhibition shape, the way water fills a space that's been vacated, and the noise resumed, and the horses moved, and the afternoon continued. Harper sat on Ashbreaker for a moment without moving. She put one hand flat on his neck. "Good boy," she said, quietly, "just for him. That was your call, not mine, and it was the right one." He exhaled. She heard boots on the ground beside her and turned. Ethan Kincaid was standing there. He'd seen it. All of it she could read, that in his face, in the specific quality of stillness he was holding, the expression of a man who has just witnessed something that confirmed something he'd been trying to understand for 6 weeks and has finally completely understood it. He looked at Ashbreaker. "He protected you," Ethan said. "Yes," Harper said. "That horse," Ethan said slowly, "spent 6 months trying to kill anyone who came near him. And today, he stopped. He had the look of a man trying to revise a very long-standing belief about how the world works, and finding that the revision requires more structural change than he'd anticipated. He learned what I was," Harper said. "It took time, but he learned it." She paused. "Most things do if you give them the right conditions." Ethan looked up at her. She was still mounted, which meant she was above him, which was not a position Ethan Kincaid occupied often relative to other people. He didn't seem bothered by it. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. "I owe you I had a man working for me for 7 years who was doing things I should have known about and confronted years before I did. And the fact that I didn't, the fact that it took a woman with a dollar bill to make me see it." He stopped, looked at the ground briefly, then back up. "That's not nothing. That's a significant failure of judgment on my part, and I'm not interested in minimizing it." Harper looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said, "it's not nothing, and I'm not going to tell you it is." She held his gaze. "But you got there. Eventually. Some men never do. That counts for something." He nodded. Once. The nod of a man receiving information he intends to carry forward rather than set down. "Victoria Granger," he said. "She found me this morning," Harper said. "She told me she intended to," Ethan said. "I may have been the one who told her your name, in detail, months ago, before I understood, before I'd thought clearly about what I was actually seeing." He paused. "I wanted you to know that I'd been talking about what you did before I'd processed what it meant." Harper held his gaze. That was an odd way to apologize. "It wasn't an apology," he said. "It was an explanation." He looked at her steadily. "The apology is this: you came to my property 6 weeks ago with the clearest kind of competence I've ever watched someone demonstrate, and my first instinct was to agree with Rourke's assessment of what you were worth. I was wrong. About that specifically, I was completely wrong, and I knew it by the time you rode that horse out of my East Corral, and I should have said it then." Harper was quiet. "Apology accepted," she said. Then, Again. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile. He wasn't a man who smiled easily, and it would have looked wrong on him right now anyway. But the possibility of one. The shape of something that might become easier with time. "Your event is in an hour," he said. "I know." He stepped back. "I'll be watching." "I know that too," she said. He walked away. Luke appeared from her left, having apparently materialized from the crowd the way Luke had a habit of doing when things were significant. "You all right?" he asked. "You have got to stop asking me that," she said. "And yet," he said. "And yet," she agreed. The afternoon event was everything the last 6 weeks had been building toward, and it lasted 11 minutes, and it was the quietest 11 minutes of the entire exhibition. Not because nothing happened, because everything that happened was exactly what it was supposed to be. Ashbreaker moved through every element of the program with the grounded, willing energy of a horse that is not performing compliance but expressing genuine partnership. His trot was long and even. His canter was balanced. When she asked him to stop, he stopped. When she asked him to move off from a halt into a collected canter, he moved with the particular quality of impulsion that comes from an animal fully engaged rather than merely responsive. The crowd was quiet in the way crowds go quiet when they're watching something that doesn't need them to be any louder. She finished the program and brought him to a halt in the center of the arena. The applause started from somewhere near the back and moved forward through the crowd the way fire moves through dry grass, fast in a single direction, unstoppable once it started. She sat straight and kept her hands still and let the sound wash over her, and she thought about a specific morning in February, standing beside a frozen creek road with her father's coat over her arm, understanding that the thing that had always seen her most clearly was gone. She thought about everything she'd carried forward from that morning to this one. The mornings before sunrise. The dollar bill. The dust of an East Corral. The horse that had learned one careful day at a time that not everything that approached him intended to hurt him. She put her hand on his neck. "We did it," she said. He walked forward on his own initiative toward the exit gate, calm, unhurried, absolutely sure of himself. She let him lead. Monday morning, Victoria Granger made an offer that was specific and serious, and significantly larger than anything Harper had let herself expect. She laid the terms out at Martha's counter with a coffee she didn't touch, and a directness that Harper appreciated more than she could easily say. The Wyoming program, lead trainer, a salary, resources, a mandate to work with exactly the kind of horses and exactly the kind of situation she'd been navigating for 6 weeks on nothing but $1 and a borrowed paddock. "I'll need an answer by Wednesday," Victoria said. "You'll have it by tomorrow," Harper said. Victoria looked at her. "You already know what it is." "I already know what it is," Harper confirmed. Martha behind the counter did not say anything, but she refilled both coffees without being asked which was her particular way of offering a blessing. Ethan Kincaid came to the paddock that evening. Not the livery she'd moved Ashbreaker back to Martha's paddock the morning after the exhibition, the post repaired by Boone's deputy before she'd even asked. He came and stood at the fence, and she was working Ashbreaker on a loose rein, just moving, just being in the space together, the way they did at the end of good days. She brought him over to the fence. Ethan and the horse regarded each other for a moment. Then Ashbreaker stretched his nose toward Ethan's hand. Ethan held very still. Let the horse smell him. After a moment he slowly raised his other hand and laid it against the horse's nose, and the horse accepted it, and the three of them were still for a moment in the evening light. "He remembers where he came from," Harper said. "I know," Ethan said. He didn't move his hand. "I've been thinking about that. About the horse. About accountability," he said. "About what you do with it, whether you spend it on guilt or on change." He paused. "I'm planning some changes at the spread, in how the horses are handled, the whole approach. I would benefit from a conversation with someone who knows what they're doing in that area." Harper looked at him. "I'm taking a position with Victoria Granger's program," she said, "starting next month." "I know," he said. "She told me. That's going to take most of my time." I understand that. He looked at her directly. I'm not asking for your time in a professional capacity. The evening was going amber around them, the same amber it had been on the day she'd ridden out of his East Corral 6 weeks ago with a horse that nobody believed was worth $1. Then what are you asking? She said. He didn't answer right away. He was the kind of man who didn't say things until he was sure of them, and she had learned to read the silence before he spoke as its own kind of information. I'm asking, he said, if there's a version of things where we start over, more honestly than we started. He met her eyes. I reckon I've been wrong about enough things lately that one more admission won't break me. Harper looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had laughed at a dollar bill on a July afternoon and found himself 42 days later standing at a paddock fence at dusk, holding his hand out to a horse that had every reason to refuse him and had chosen not to. She thought about what her father used to say, that you could tell everything about a person's character by what they did with something that had been hurt, whether they wrote it off or stayed with it, whether they walked away or did the harder, slower, less certain work of rebuilding trust one careful day at a time. Ethan Kincaid had fired the man who'd been herding his horses, had driven out to a paddock on a morning when he didn't have to, had told a woman twice 3 times that he had been wrong in the specific, unambiguous language of a man who understood the weight of the words. One condition, Harper said. He waited. You let me work, she said. Whatever I do, however I do it, you don't second-guess the method, because it doesn't look like what you're used to. You trust the results, or you ask the question directly. No going sideways. No Rourke-style interference from any direction. Agreed, he said, without hesitation. Then yes, she said. There's a version of things where we start over. He exhaled slowly. The exhale of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just been given at last a place to set it down. She turned Ashbreaker back toward the center of the paddock and let him walk loose and easy in the evening light, with no destination and no particular goal except the simple, sufficient fact of moving forward. Harper Lane had come to the Kincaid spread 6 weeks ago with $1 and a certainty that nobody around her could yet see the reason for, and she had done exactly what she said she would do. Not because the world made it easy. Not because the people in it stepped aside, but because she had learned from the best horseman she'd ever known that the only way through a thing that's been broken wrong is patience, presence, and the refusal to stop believing in what you can see that others can't. She had given that to a horse, and the horse had given it back to her, and that was the whole truth of it, and that was enough.